Coming up on Maine Challenge, Representative Seth Berry of Bowdenham. We'll talk about energy and a lot more. Hello and welcome to Maine Challenge, a production of Lincoln County Television and Lincoln County Indivisible. Today our guest is Seth Berry, state representative from Bowdenham, a veteran of the Maine legislature, chairman of the Energy Committee in the legislature. Welcome, Seth.
Hey, great to be with you, Chuck. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you. We served at least 3 terms together. Maybe.
You did.
I went 4 and out, and you're coming back for more.
I'm a sucker. I'm like a bad penny, Chuck. I just keep turning up in Augusta.
Well, I appreciate your passion, especially, and your knowledge, especially about energy and power issues. My observation has been that the founders of Central Maine Power are spinning in their graves over what's happening with that company right now. And I'd love to hear you talk about your proposal for Maine public power.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to, Chuck. And you're right. You know, CMP is no longer the company that it once was, the Maine-owned company it once was. It was bought first by Energy East and then Iberdrola. And Iberdrola itself is owned, it's a giant multinational based in Spain, but owned by oil-based government funds from Norway, oil-based government funds from Qatar, Spanish banks that go back to the Franco regime, and also BlackRock, which is a famous multinational investment bank, investment corporation. And you know, none of these investors have the interests of Maine anywhere on their radar. Many of them don't know where Maine is. They just know that they own a piece of Iberdrola and that it has many investments all over the world. The grid is our future. We need to electrify our entire economy in order to decarbonize and get off of our addiction to oil. Our 5-6 billion a year that we spend on oil has been hurting Maine for a long time, but it's also hurting our ability to lead on climate and to be a part of the climate solution. We have so much at stake here. Our electric grid really is the lifeline, and for that reason, I believe we need to adopt a proven model, which is called consumer-owned electricity, and finance the grid at much lower costs. Tax-exempt revenue bonds are the mechanism that consumer-owned utilities use. We have 8 consumer-owned utilities here in Maine already, in places like Vinyl Haven and Van Buren, places like Calais and Kennebunk. They serve very well, 18% lower rates, much better reliability. It's a proven model. And 1 in 3 Americans across the country get their power from some kind of consumer-owned utility, whether it's what's called a co-op or a muni or a municipal hybrid, such as I propose. But 1 in 3 Americans are getting that better deal right now and are better positioned for the critical role that our grid will play, our poles and wires, if you will play in the future of our entire economy, not just in Maine, but across the U.S. and around the world. So that's the genesis of the proposal. Again, it's a proven model. We just need to do it. And believe it or not, it will save us money from day one, because you're basically, if you're refinancing your home mortgage at a lower interest rate, you save money from day one. You know, it might be a large amount that's included in the price, but it does save you money. The grid is a monopoly. The company is allowed to serve the people of Maine and to use the public rights of way and to have you and to have me as a captive customer. Because we allow it. And so simply by changing the law and paying the corporation, Iberdrola, and its shareholders what the assets are worth, we can do this and save money from day one and position ourselves better for the kind of growth, the kind of central role that the electrical grid will have in our future.
Speaking of day one, how does this actually start? Do we go to Central Maine Power and say, well, you remember all that money you made? You're not going to make that much anymore. And I mean, what's the first step in this after the law is passed and signed by the governor?
Well, you hit on a really you hit on the crux of the resistance. The reason that CMP has been fighting this so much and insisting that they oppose the bill and saying all kinds of crazy things about it, which are not true, is that they do have a lot of future profits at stake, and so they won't go down without a fight. But we had an independent analysis done. It came back saying it was completely legal, completely constitutional. It's just really a matter of what the purchase price needs to be and how much money we're going to be saving on day one. Not whether, but how much money we're going to be saving on day one. That would be essentially established through a refereed process. We set up a board that is partially elected and then with some qualified appointees as well, confirmed by a public process and a vote of the entire state senate. You get this board together. They prepare for the takeover and initiate the refereed process. It's possible that CMP, maybe likely that CMP would take it to court. The courts would decide, and you move forward. So it would take a couple of years to actually effectuate the change and flip the switch, if you will. But once we flip the switch, we can expect to see savings going forward, and an asset which would be owned by Maine people. There's one problem with my mortgaging, refinancing your mortgage at a lower interest rate analogy, and that is we don't own it right now. We're basically renters. So it's actually more like you're right now we're paying rent, and we could be paying mortgage at a lower monthly amount, but we haven't decided to do that yet. So what the bill LD 1646 would do is let us go forward in that way.
So it would set up a new power company, basically owned by the citizens of Maine.
That's right. Yeah.
It'll have a board of directors, and it will set rates, and the board will set rates, I assume. And the management will be who?
So the management would be hired by the board. They would hire an executive director, and then they would put out an RFP for a competitive bid for a qualified operations team to come in and manage the actual day-to-day operations of the grid. So you'd still have a private sector operator. It's basically a nonprofit, not publicly owned but privately operated model, and it's worked well in other places. There are some people who want to be completely public, and I understand that. I chose to go with the competitive market approach for the day-to-day operations, but either way, you bring in that tax-exempt low-cost capital. You remove the profit motive, so you're not bleeding, 150 million, 120 million, whatever it is per year in profits to investors who couldn't even put Maine on a map.
Sort of like healthcare.
It is, except that healthcare, in a strange way, it's not a quite such a monopoly structure. I mean, you could argue that the hospitals
but the profit motive is being taken away from people,
right?
And that's there's not a lot of precedent for that, to turn around and say to somebody who's making a profit, okay, that's enough. I support it, but I wonder how it's going to really work in practical application.
Yeah.
And I wondered that when President Obama was trying to create the Affordable Care Act, and he finally had to cave in on the pharmaceutical companies and some of the big healthcare companies.
Yeah.
And I wonder about how that would work here too. And I'd love to see it successful. I'd love to see it presented in my lifetime.
Right. Well, the good news, Chuck, is it has been done before. It was done in the state of Nebraska in the 1940s when a Republican U.S. Senator, George Norris, pushed through a reform there that was similar, that said we're going to move in the direction of nonprofit, consumer-owned utilities. And Nebraska, to this day, has held on to that because it's worked so well for them. They have some of the cheapest power and the most reliable power, in other words, the fewest outages of any state in the nation. And there are some other reasons for that besides the consumer ownership, but they're very proud and very attached to their consumer-owned electricity out in Nebraska. It's been done in Long Island. The Long Island Power Authority was converted, came into existence as a conversion of a previously investor-owned utility that served all of Long Island, many more customers than in the state of Maine. Back in 1998, I believe it was, when they flipped the switch there, the stationary on your bill changed, and the other change that people noticed was that their rates dropped by 20% on day one, so immediate savings. It happened also in a small city in Florida called Winter Park, and that story also originated from outages. They were concerned about the many outages they were having. Maine is similar. We have the worst outages in the nation. Their issues were primarily related to hurricanes. They wanted the company to bury more of the lines. The company was not cooperating. So they held a referendum across the city, voted to convert those poles and wires to a consumer ownership. Long story short, they did it. It's been over a decade, and rates have gone down. They buried all the lines, and they have no outages now. So there's just a few examples. It's happened elsewhere, for example, with water utilities. The city of Pittsburgh, for example. There are other types of utilities that have converted, and there are other utilities in the electrical arena that have done this. So it's not without precedent. And remember, we have the 8 consumer-owned utilities that I mentioned here in Maine that are also a proven model.
Is this a major benefit in the whole effort to decarbonize the state of Maine? I mean, do we really move the ball down the field with this?
We do, in a massive way, and it really comes from 2 different advantages. One is that this entity would be only responsible to what is in the best interest of its customers. It would not have a profit motive, so it wouldn't be looking to overbuild the grid to create transmission infrastructure where it is not necessary. That motivation right now comes in simply because of a constitutional requirement across the country. It goes back to a couple of Supreme Court cases in the 1940s and 20s that I think of as sort of the Citizens United of the utility world. It essentially requires that investor-owned utilities be compensated typically at double-digit interest rates for the investments that they make in the grid, and it creates a perverse incentive. They tend to want to put up lines where they're not needed, or transformers, or substations, or what have you, where they're not needed. We saw an example in the Booth Bay region where someone came in and was allowed by the PUC to do a pilot to use solar and storage to meet a need that CMP said existed. And they ended up getting permission to do that and they did it at 1/3 of the cost. So you absolutely can have more of those kinds of savings to ratepayers and smarter development of the grid, microgrids and distributed resources, solar, storage, efficiency. You can have much more of that when you have a utility that cares about saving money, not taking more money from ratepayers. So that's number one. The second reason that you save money and that we can improve our transition to a cleaner future is that the grid will need a lot of build out. There's no question. We need to basically triple the overall capacity of the grid to move electrons around. If we're going to have heat pumps to heat and cool our buildings, like the one on the wall behind me, instead of oil furnaces, which are 60% of Maine homes right now, if we're going to have electric vehicles to get us to work or to shop or move goods around, that will require a massive amount of new electrical infrastructure. And all of that new investment can either be paid for at very high interest rates, as I've mentioned, or at very low tax-exempt interest rates, which is the mechanism that consumer-owned utilities use. So Dr. Richard Silkman, who actually developed that Booth Bay project I mentioned, and is a very well-known energy economist, Yale PhD, ran the state planning office under Governor McKernan, has done very well for himself in advising industrial clients in the energy market. He has done a comprehensive analysis that says we will save $9 billion for Maine people by doing this over the first 30 years. And that amount will increase going forward. That money can be reinvested. It can be plowed back into the kinds of climate mitigation and climate adaptation that we need. It can also be used, by the way, for better broadband. High-speed internet also uses poles and wires, and if you own those poles, you can allow fiber optic infrastructure from Maine-based companies to attach to those poles at lower cost, and make sure that the state of Maine has truly entered the 21st century.
And I would think that a consumer-owned power company would also make it easier for decentralizing, so that a neighborhood or a individual property owner could invest their own money and save ultimately on whether it's wind or solar or whatever source is most appropriate for that property. And I think I don't know. I would think that's true. Am I right, or am I?
You're absolutely right. I mentioned the Booth Bay project, and that is an example of that. Another I'll give you is that Central Maine Power has for decades fought against efficiency measures and against the widespread adoption of rooftop solar. They were the reason that under Governor LePage, the new rule of gross metering was created, which replaced a longstanding net metering policy. Net metering, basically, if you have solar, allows you to put some electrons onto the grid and take them back later at no charge to you. Although you do pay a monthly minimum fee to the utility just to be hooked up. And net metering was revoked and replaced by this bizarre scheme called gross metering, which basically levied a fee for people on the owner of the rooftop solar, even when they were producing their own energy and using it in their own household. They were being charged as if it was being transmitted over the grid. Very bizarre policy, unprecedented anywhere in the world. And unfortunately, my bill last year was passed to do away with gross metering and go back to net metering. But these are the kinds of battles we've had for decades with Central Maine Power. And it's all about that, exactly what you're saying, Chuck. They don't want us to literally have our power in our own hands. They want to control our power rather than us controlling it. And we could do so much more in this state if we had a little more control over our own power destiny.
Well, I'm sold. I was sold beforehand, but I'm even more sold now. I didn't, until I was in the legislature, I didn't fully appreciate the role that conservation, energy conservation, can play in making our world and our homes a better place. And I was really bowled over by the reality. And now, as a retired individual living in a too large house with my wife of many years, I want to think, what can I do? What can an individual do to make a difference in the climate crisis and to save money? And this is it. I mean, a public power makes a huge stride in that regard. I'm not supposed to be the salesman here, but I'm totally there for it, and I really appreciate your hard work on it. You've got other things going on too. You're running again for the legislature, correct?
That's right. Yep.
And this would be your seventh term.
Yep.
You are the veteran. You and John Martin are the old grizzled. Is John running again?
John Martin is also running for re-election as well.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
He's a little ahead of me though. I've got a lot of catching up to do. Yeah. I want to be John Martin.
You've got some catching up to do. How does the state of Maine and the legislature play into the Green New Deal as we move forward with it?
Well, Chuck, it's interesting because I hear Green New Deal, and it's obviously controversial. People love it or they hate it. There seems to be very little in between. But I think it's important to ask ourselves what we mean by that. When AOC first introduced the bill, it was basically a resolution that we were going to do some good things for climate and for jobs and a just transition. That's incredibly important, but there wasn't a lot of specificity there as to exactly how we're going to do this. I think the frame is absolutely right. FDR, interestingly, was a huge proponent of consumer-owned power and a huge opponent to the power barons, as he called them, of his time. By the way, Percival Baxter also had huge battles, legendary battles with Central Maine Power back in the day over control of the rivers. So there was a strong tradition even then of public power. But obviously, we're at a time where we need to save our economy and save our climate. So we need to be green, and we do need a New Deal. I would argue that this measure, LD 1646, is exactly that. I don't refer to it as a Green New Deal, but I think it is exactly the kind of thing that FDR wanted. George Norris of Nebraska, who I mentioned, a Republican, worked very closely with the Roosevelt administration on his initiatives in Nebraska. Together they created the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is an example of public power. And the Bonneville Power Authority as well, out in Washington State. So, this lineage is very strong, and I think there are other measures that we can look at. People are talking about a green bank, for example, to help bring low-cost capital. It might help to fund the kinds of home or business efficiency projects that you mentioned, as being important. Absolutely support that. Maybe that could help to fund charging stations. I think it would work in a very complementary way with this consumer-owned power initiative. We have to absolutely do more to help people to weatherize and to convert to electricity. Heat pumps are a pretty low-hanging fruit. They're an easy way to help people get off of oil and save money. So we can help people to do that. And the jobs in electricity, what we call beneficial electrification, helping people to electrify their lives, are well-paying and can be very useful in that regard as well. Maine has some good workers already in the renewable energy sector. We can do a lot more with that. We have some good training programs through our community colleges. So I think that too, workforce concerns are a big part of the Green New Deal as well. At least the way I think of the Green New Deal. So, it depends what you mean by it, but in concept, I'm all on board, and I think this is certainly part of that overall effort to take back our power and our destiny.
Yeah. I'm also concerned about the so-called corridor.
Yeah.
The concept of cutting a line through the state of Maine, which includes some untouched wilderness getting completely cut up by this, just to deliver power to Greater Boston doesn't seem to be a very good deal for the state of Maine. Is the corridor a step backwards in the effort to decarbonize, to address a climate crisis, to create a consumer-owned power grid? How does the corridor fit in on that?
Yeah, the corridor is a bad deal. I will say that it will satisfy some immediate appetite for clean energy, or lower cost energy, which is some argue to be clean. I think there's a very legitimate debate about that, about the mega hydro and whether it's simply being redirected. The way I think of it, Chuck, is we can either do this to the benefit of Maine's economy, or we can do it to the benefit of others. And we need to be talking about leafy greens and whole grains, not junk food. And there's a tendency to want to go for what seems easy and what the latest thing somebody's trying to sell you on the shelves in the fancy packaging, but it might satisfy your appetite for a short period of time, but then you're only more hungry later on, and you're starting to get chubby and you're starting to get diabetes. Maine can do this the right way.
Don't get personal here.
Okay, sorry for the you there. I just this is I think about my own diet that way. There may be things that taste good and make me feel better right away, but if I eat more healthy, I'll be better off in the long run. This is about precedent to me, Chuck. If there's going to be a line, and again, this is not necessarily new hydro, it may just be redirected. There's huge negative consequences to the people downriver in Hudson Bay, the indigenous peoples that are living below those dams, eating fish that now are poisoned by methyl mercury, which forms in the reservoirs. There are big issues there. But even supposing that you wanted to allow Massachusetts or help Massachusetts to buy a bunch of hydro from Canada, which, by the way, that is a consumer-owned utility up there, which is doing very nicely, doing very, very well for itself up in Quebec. Let's talk about the options. Massachusetts initially said they wanted to go to New Hampshire. New Hampshire said no. Now they went with the bid from CMP going through Maine. If Maine says no, third in the bid stack in Massachusetts list of options is a fully permitted line in Vermont. Vermont has permitted this project at the municipal level, at the state level, and the feds have also permitted it. So it's ahead of CMP's project in that regard. And here's what it would do for Vermont. It would give them 3 times the financial benefit to the state that we are projected to receive from the CMP line. 3 times the financial benefit. In addition, there would not be one single tree cut down. That's another reason they really like the project in Vermont and have permitted it. It would be fully buried under existing lake bed and under existing roadways. So not one tree cut down. No wonder Vermont likes it. Well, maybe that is the precedent that we as a region, as a tri-state region, want to set, so that the next time Massachusetts wants a big slug of hydropower from Quebec, they need to cut a better deal.
Thank you very much, Seth Berry, Representative. We really appreciate all your good work, but especially the passion and skill with your driving this particular bus.
Thanks, Chuck. Keep up the great work. Indivisible.
Show your support for Maine Challenge and LCTV's programming. We're all about community. Please go to lctv.org to make a contribution. Your support makes us stronger together.